Welcome.
You have arrived at your destination.
Clear of the closing doors, please.
I'm Emily Lutzker.
And I'm Anna Kamasia. Today, International Arrival speaks with Nicholas Galanin, or Yik Gatsin, who is a multidisciplinary artist and musician of the Sitka tribe of Alaska and of Tlingit and Unaga descent. His work centers upon colonial encounters and historical amnesia, the complexities of contemporary Indigenous culture and representation, and the relationships between Native and non-Native communities and identities. Welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for being here on our podcast, and we're really very excited to have you here. So thank you for taking time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I believe you're calling in from Sitka, Alaska now, but I know that you've been traveling a lot, exhibiting all over, and even just in Qatar for Art Basel. Is that true?
Yes, I was in Qatar for possible future project, but Basel was happening during the time, so I got to go experience and see some of that as well. But yeah, I've been on the road quite a bit.
Was that the first time that you'd gone to Qatar?
It is, yeah. Never been. So it was great just to be out there and meet some of the community and see some of the museums and architecture. I was out in that region a few years ago. I had a project out there and I've spoken out there before.
It must be a really different sense of the land too, like when you're in desert.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it really is.
I was in Sharjah a few years ago for the Sharjah Biennial, and I was just really impressed with the buildings. Like Sharjah is different than Dubai because it keeps traditional architecture.
I've not been to Sharjah yet. Hopefully I'll be able to make it out there.
It was a really incredible experience. I wanted to start by talking about Never Forget, because first of all, the large sculptural project that you created for Desert X in Palm Springs in 2021, which mimics the Hollywood sign, and it spells out the words Indian land in 45-foot tall letters. I mean, it's really large. And I want to start with this work for a couple of reasons. The first is that this past couple of years, I've seen photographs of that work everywhere. It was in the Toronto Biennial. It was part of Jean Quick-to-See-Smith's exhibition at the Zimmerly in New Jersey. And then it was also part of a show that was here in the Lower East Side, An Incomplete Haunting, The Past Is Not Past, which was curated by Rachel Gugelberger. And in fact, I even have your poster on my door to my house because the Zimmerly made posters for it of like the whole exhibition. And so on the back, you unfolded and it's the photograph of Never Forget. I think because of that, people are really thinking about that work right now. I think it's reflective of this moment. The second reason I wanted to talk about it is because I feel like it encapsulates a lot of things in your work related to colonial contact, the violence of settler colonialism, Indigenous land rights, most obviously, and racism, particularly racism in Hollywood. And so perhaps you could elaborate a little bit about the project and about this relationship of the Never Forget sign that spells out Indian land and the Hollywood sign, because maybe people don't know that connection.
Sure. What year was that? 21, I believe, maybe. Yeah. So I was invited to Desert X to submit a proposal for the biennial, I think 3 years prior to that, and went out and did some site visits. And when I visit places, I'm aware of chosen histories and narratives of a place that'll surface through language, that'll surface through place names, that'll surface through all different aspects of cultural identity and I guess the health of a community in ways. And for this, one narrative that was popular for like Palm Springs, which is Agua Caliente territories and Coahuila territory, is Hollywood's playground and Bob Hope Street, all of these things. So connecting some of that popular narrative that romanticizes an industry that has largely misrepresented Indigenous communities, going back to like Hollywood Western and stuff, and cowboys and Indians, which are kind of, these are supremacist narratives of like, we're good, you're bad. Tying that in directly with the iconography of this industry and connecting it directly to the land was for me the Hollywood sign, which historically it's become an icon of sorts for, maybe an American dream. But the original signage was Hollywood land. Land was removed later, like much of the land that was removed from indigenous people. And it was an aspect not really talked about this signage is that it was erected as a advertisement, real estate advertisement for white only communities, so segregated. And this is, these are the stories of history of displacement in our spaces. Fast forward to now, especially in that 2018, a lot of institutional spaces were, participating in this form of land acknowledgement. That this work is more about action over acknowledgement, and the real kind of ephemeral part that lives on in this work when the work is gone is that the action still exists and there's still room for it. And this was a call to action to ask non-Indigenous landowners to return title of land back to Indigenous care. This was also an opportunity to speak about the histories of land and how reservations were created or not created, how lands are unceded in different spaces and places, how just the relationships that we have towards our ancestral homelands and the colonial government. I mean, even talking about treaties, every treaty's been broken.
I mean, I felt like the piece was so poignant when I saw it. I mean, I didn't see the real thing. I saw the photograph.
And in person, it was so like massive and large because it was representing the scale of the Hollywood sign 1-to-1.
And also in a very prominent place in Palm Springs, right? Wasn't it where you take the tramway up to the top?
Yes. And the landscape out there scale is deceptive too, because,
Absolutely.
things can shrink pretty quick or feel like they are. Also, there was and still currently exists, is a GoFundMe that was set up just for if you can't return land, you don't have legal title to the land, but you want to do some action, then give some money to this GoFundMe, which was a kind of an immediate form of access for people to contribute, even $1, $2. It ended up that land was acquired, like legal title of land from the start of this. Obviously, sovereignty and land back mean many different things beyond legal title of land, where you still pay federal government tax to care for a place or land. But something interesting happened in this space too that I was kind of aware of, and it could almost be its own project too. So this work infiltrated algorithms through like social media and selfies. It became largely documented by visitors. The contrast of statistic of who's willing to participate in that form versus participate in a real actionable form. These are kind of interesting social aspects to the piece, I think. And I don't have the story in front of me, but there was it must have been in Oklahoma or somewhere, where tribal community was trying to buy back sacred land that was on the market. And NALC put support forward to try to make that happen in a capitalist commercial kind of existence where, where the only thing that really matters, I guess, is the dollar amount that someone's willing to buy or pay for something. They didn't get the acquisition of the land back, and it went to a commercial entity.
Oh, wow.
So these are, this is what's being contended with sometimes when communities are trying to, get some reclamation and stewardship to place back, and doing so through any means sometimes,
And I mean, this is not a new thing either.
The complex histories of these indigenous communities across the U.S. is so varied. There's a lot of layers that we can weave in and out of in conversation with this piece. And one that was very specific and intentional was the term Indian and the use of that. in this piece, particularly because it was speaking towards US, North America, even South America. And it was speaking intentionally towards stereotype. It was speaking towards pan, like this whole like one representation, which the US government was very intentional about in the genocide, in the removal, in all of the violence and oppression, to remove individual language and identity and to group into one. We're legally bound by this term still. I have an Indian number, federally registered with the US government. And then there's people that don't have them, and the government does not recognize them, but the land recognizes them, and the history of that recognizes them. So this idea that we have to be acknowledged or recognized to be in existence by a government or a power is also highly oppressive to communities.
Absolutely. I always find it very interesting. I just did a project in Winnipeg with Indigenous and Métis communities. We had a sharing circle at a certain point, and everybody would talk about like where they were from, where their parents were from, what treaty, what tribe, because it's not about a particular place, because so many Indigenous communities were moved as well. So like it's not necessarily that you're on the land where you were.
Yeah. I mean, the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears and all of the reservations that displaced people onto lands that were thought to be, barren or useless or wastelands or those are all parts of this conversation too. And then once minerals were found in those spaces, that's when that movie called that talks about this history. There's a book, Killers of the Flower Moon was the recent it was a story written by a non-Indigenous person covering this history.
Exactly.
U.S. government made a law that the most wealthy people, the U.S. at that time, which were Indigenous people that owned the mineral rights to their reservation lands or their lands, could not care for the wealth themselves. They had to have essentially a white person care for their money. That's when the murders started happening. And these Indigenous people were being murdered, and the inheritance went to these caretakers. But this is all part of these conversations too, in a lot of ways. So I know that there was also Indigenous writers that have written about this history.
Absolutely. And the thing that always surprises me is that it's not part of this, the sort of appeal, I think, of this project, Never Forget, is all of this history that is woven into it, as you're articulating, but also the relationship of Palm Springs specifically to Hollywood, and that whole narrative, as you said, of cowboys and Indians, of the Wild West, of it being there for the taking, of the idea of the cowboy who rides off into the sunset and, takes the land and takes the people. And so I think it's a really interesting project to put in Palm Springs, because I think that also exists there today. I mean, I'm not saying they're making cowboy and Indian films still in Hollywood.
Sure. I mean, all of California, the amount of erasure in the history of Indigenous peoples.
It's also the fantasy and the romanticism, as you said. It's both of those things, but it's this fake romanticism where, in order to have that, there was a violent displacement that had to exist in order to create that.
I would say it still exists right now. Yes. We're witnessing it in various forms. We're witnessing it at the border. We're witnessing it with ICE agents out there. And I know Indigenous people in those spaces that are like near, say, Minneapolis and such, that won't send their kids to school right now. That's the terror. That's like a white terror. They won't send their kids to school. They won't go to the grocery store.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It's absolutely fucking terrifying.
And that's connected. This is connected all the way back to, I would say, the militarization of settlers, which is the amendment, the right to bear arms, creating and arming a community who is actively displacing Indigenous communities. So manifest destiny is kind of the way that it's looked at, spoken about, and understood. as if it was someone's God's right to have this land. And that's connected to what is it? Is it the Second Amendment? Is it right to bear arms?
Yeah, I believe so. Yep.
It is. Okay. Yeah. So, and that's spoken about in, is it Roxanne Ortiz has a book out about the indigenous people's history of the United States or something like that. Anyways, it's spoken a little bit about that in that sense. And it's a militarization of settlers to perpetuate.
From the very beginning. From the very beginning. Yeah.
Like law enforcement is, military is, ICE absolutely
I
is.
feel like the two of those combined.
Right.
Hey? Yeah. I think that America has started what is America on violence, and it just keeps escalating in my mind.
Sure.
People talk about justice, and I think they talk about, oh, I can't believe that we're not having justice at this moment. And I think, well, did you ever? Like, it was built on the erasure of indigenous people, and then you had slavery. And I mean, like, when was there a just United States? When you're thinking about work, is this something that you think about, how to bring these histories, these questions into visibility? Like, is that something that is important to you?
It can be. Yeah. I think of work as an opportunity sometimes to directly engage place, time, community, and to do it in layered ways. I've realized that we can't really like change somebody, or I'm not here to like teach or change somebody. But if I create work that includes a lot of, these truths or these experiences or these narratives and histories, and it engages somebody in such a way that they feel like they've taught themselves something, then I think it's more impactful and the change is happening.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. So they have to come to it rather than you bringing it to them.
Certainly. And a lot of this work isn't here to tell people. A lot of the work provides a mirror, or it provides a position. I don't know. It shows the viewer their position, maybe more so, and than mine or somebody's. So
Never forget, as well as another bronze sculpture that I wanted to talk about called I Think It Goes Like This, Pick Yourself Up, which I believe was in Boston. Both of them, they're not viewed only by a museum going, a gallery going audience. They're out there in the public.
yeah, it's public space. And
yeah. And that one I think It Goes Like This. It's a large public bronze sculpture cast from a mix-up collection of imitation totems, not made by indigenous carvers, and sort of a very different scale than Never Forget. But the rearrangement itself, it reveals this sort of colonialist mindset, this sort of bizarre colonialist mindset, because it looks like a statue.
I was aware of Boston, going into Boston for the public art triennial, of how many like monuments and statues and bronze works they have. And I've chosen bronze as a material that engages that history in ways. So for the use of monument or the use of a statue, and to create it in something that is associated with permanence, I feel like that's a immediate like aspect to material like bronze, is that it's this power and permanence. And as we revisit history, and as communities, stories and experiences exchange, we start to, I don't know, question those who are represented in these histories. Take Andrew Jackson's at Lafayette Square, I think that's where it is. I did a work with the silhouette of that piece. I think some of this ties to probably Roman history, and a lot of these ideas around what empire might be have been kind of taken from those spaces in a lot of ways. So I did a bronze work at the Liverpool Biennial, again, looking at the history in Liverpool. It was directly connected to the US in a lot of ways, in the trafficking of enslaved people, and the immense wealth that came through tobacco. That tobacco was often grown in the US on indigenous land. So in that era in Liverpool, streets were named after those that became wealthy in this, and they created bronzes and marbles of themselves or their wives or the family or whatever, trying to directly pull from, I think some of the European Roman kind of history of statue. And they essentially painted themselves into this history. And as we look at the history and understand how oppressive it was to certain communities and stuff to could gain access as well, it becomes a very different conversation. So looking at statues and monuments and doing work in Boston around, the figureheads that are represented by power, it also includes this conversation of whose history is celebrated and how is it told and whose history is erased. And modern example of the intentional framing of this is Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, who had nothing to do with anything, and especially in Alaska, beyond, this kind of becoming this right-wing political martyr, was like the day after Indigenous Peoples Day, the governor here is like, it's Charlie Kirk Day. And we're like, why? What? like, what is this other than you reframing and trying to paint a figure into history? It slowly happens over intentional time, where eventually this really problematic voice podcaster that was like misleading young boys with patriarchy and racism is going to end up on the $5 bill someday at this rate. This is how these things are fabricated and fed. And knowing that and watching it now, it's worth looking at all of these figures historically and understanding like who's been placed here.
I think it's really interesting too, after the murder of George Floyd, this question about monuments became part of public discourse, right? Everybody was thinking about, okay, what do we do with monuments? Do we keep them? Do we take them down? Do we just, graffiti them? And I think there have been some interesting choices. I don't know what you think, but like the General Lee monument was taken down and then given to, I believe it was the Virginia Museum of Black History. That's not the right title.
Some people are like, no, this is history and preserve it. And then these are probably the same folks that are cheering when Saddam's bronze topples. And so the conversation doesn't go both ways for everybody. Oftentimes, if you want to find a contradiction in there, we could probably find it. Preservation is something really interesting, and the idea of contextualization is really important. And the work that I did at the Biennale of Sydney, I think was successful in.
That's called Shadow on the Land, an Excavation and a Bush Burial, that one?
Correct.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I think it's a really interesting choice.
Nicholas, you just led right into it, and that was the next on our list of questions here.
Oh,
so
good.
Because
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting choice. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the project.
That work was engaging with a monument or a statue in Hyde Park in Sydney, Australia. And it was doing so without the actual statue present. I mean, it was better that it wasn't there because it was showing that we could have these conversations and not lose history.
I show it to my class. We have, a couple of units on monuments, and we have debates about what should we do with these monuments, and should we remove them? Should we keep them in a museum where we can give context to them? When it came to yours, this particular piece, the students got really excited. They were like, this is perfect. This is like, so they get really excited about the fact that you have chosen to sort of not present or represent the statue, but you have it in this cyclical way of like being buried and being excavated at the same time. And you hold it in that space of doing both actions, which I think is really beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah. I was doing some site research and I was out there prior to the project, and I think I went up to Tiwi Islands, which is up by Papua New Guinea, and I went to the first landing site where I believe it was a Dutch. I might be wrong. I don't have the information right in front of me. Actually touched on what is so-called Australia right now. And to me, that was interesting because, again, we go to the chosen narratives that are perpetuated. And the chosen narrative in so-called Australia is that Captain Cook there's a discovery plaque on that statue. And the reality is, again, this oppressive supremacy and terra nullius is what they call it in Australia, where this is barren land, and that the indigenous community there is fauna, which is often textbook in perpetuating genocides or oppression or violence towards people, is dehumanizing them. Once they're dehumanized, then this stuff becomes, even more possible for societies or communities to continue. And so landing at this site, I went to the first site where the actual landings happened that were documented, going back to Sydney and knowing like the 250th anniversary in Australia, which the US has coming up right now shortly, becomes this like form of celebration of kind of like colonial lies and erasure and non-acknowledgement of people and oppression. I knew that was coming up, and I wanted to create a work that was engaging this, kind of preparing yourself for it. A lot of indigenous people, when 4th of July in the US is coming up, you have to prepare yourself for like, oh, what is this yearly celebration? And it kind of deepens the propaganda of a nation and nationalism in ways, I think, towards people that want to shoot fireworks off or, what everything is. But
and just makes you question the whole idea of nationhood and what that means and who's included and who's not included. Like all of those questions come up.
Absolutely. So with this work, the original concept, which I'm kind of glad didn't work out, I think it was for the better, was to actually excavate the shadow of the monument next to it. And, that would never happen. It was just not like bureaucratically within the city governments, and they'd be like, no. And that's what they said. So I moved it to this other site, and it was much stronger, I think, visually and better to have this without the statue there. The work excavates an archaeological kind of process. And I think this ties the conversation into, I don't know, the history of archaeology as problematic, and it's all the way down to like, I don't know, the supremacist or white supremacist sciences that were engaged in this, and the centering of one community to the world, and the
deliberate looting of
certainly, yeah, the actual looting of it, for sure.
Yeah.
And the idea that something that has the word discover on it absolutely fails to recognize or acknowledge one of the oldest communities on earth that has technology, culture, medicine, social, and just absolutely choosing to not see it or say it. Yet when you dig down, you'll find all of that in the soil right beneath you. Also, yes, it was about digging deep enough to bury that statue is the concept and idea of that.
As well, like unearth all of these untold, unspoken histories and all of the violence.
Well, and you're unearthing the contradiction of discovery. You're literally finding proof of existence and community. One more part of that work that I think is worth noting is that in the title, An Excavation in Bush Burial, there's a painting in I don't know which was the National Gallery or one of the museums in Sydney by a European artist of that era. And I'm drawing a blank on their name right now, but and it was called a bush burial. Maybe that's the full title. I'll have to look. And it was this fabricated, romanticized painting of the first settler being buried into so-called Australian land, as if it was like this stake or claim in a sense.
Yes.
Kind of references that as well.
Yeah, it's a painting by Australian artist Frederick McCubbin, painted in
That's the one.
1890. That's, I think. Absolutely, it's staking claim to this land, isn't it? And saying, my body is here. Meanwhile,
I'm 5 generations Alaskan, or it's like a part of this legitimacy and erasure at the same time.
absolutely.
Earlier on, when we were talking, you mentioned this term layering, which I immediately think of when I think about your work. And one piece that I'm very drawn to called The Imaginary Indian, where it's so layered using the materials and the symbols that aren't necessarily there's nothing authentic about them, yet the authenticity shines through. And I wanted to just describe it for people that are listening and don't see it in front of them. So you have a totem pole that's covered in wallpaper against a wall that's covered in the same wallpaper. And the wallpaper is recognizable as a Victorian pattern. And the effect is that the totem pole is somewhat camouflaged because it's covered in the same pattern, but yet you see the form still visible in front of it. And the Victorian era, which was an era that was particularly severe in US history for Native Americans, the broken treaties, the land stolen, the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation that we've been talking about. So, but together, each material itself is this kind of a signifier of a layered meaning. But I believe that the materials, it's a Victorian wallpaper, so which isn't an indigenous object. And I think that in the description of the materials, it's an Indonesian replica of a totem pole and not actually a totem pole itself, if I'm correct in that. So
Yeah.
So this stolen aspects and layering of the things that aren't really indigenous, but yet communicate this kind of heartbreak.
So those works, particularly if we were to really just look at some of the sources of material and imagery and object, working with curio, so like working with, say, non-indigenous objects carved to replicate or appropriate indigenous language. Our visual art is a language. And so this choice of using that can do a lot of things. It's like a cultural consumption, other people taking things from us, but without us and wanting to have it. It's like the furthest you can be from community care. It's colonialism when you're just taking an object and you're abandoning those that are that object and what that object represents, which is our indigenous communities, our practices, our culture, our land, our sustenance, our water. All of those things are tied into that. The removal of it, you get this shell that's like this ghost. It's like this soulless kind of placeholder of conquest or consumption. And so when I say Indonesian, it's also those communities are being taken advantage of by an entrepreneur who says, you can carve well. Here's a photo. I'll pay you very little.
Make me one of these.
You carve it. I'll bring it back to Alaska and I'll sell it to the tourists that get off the ship. And they can bring their idea of Alaska home. And it's everything without us. So folding that into other visual imagery, wallpaper was one form of disappearing it out of ceremony and into decor or home. Some of the first ones I had done in this, I reference that era of wallpaper, which has these very like kind of country, I don't know, activities, making wine and picnicking and like swinging in the French countryside or whatever, as an era where the absolute opposite was happening in our communities, where the ceremonies were banned, or where children were being forcibly removed from families and languages were being stolen. So all of these things in contrast.
Yeah. And that comes across clearly as a heartbreak, a sadness.
The hand of indigeneity is so fetishized in the maker that that this work returns some of that work back to Indigenous perspective and community through concept and through being, critical of these engagements in ways. So, yeah.
What's your process like in creating a work like this?
I mean, and work like this is finding the forms and then selecting the imagery. And then, of course, it's just painted over the totem to get the camouflaged version of it. Those same forms are referenced in that bronze. I think it goes like this: pick yourself up, which is the idea that we have to construct ideas of ourselves from people's consumption of us, from people's stereotype of us, and from misrepresentations of us. And we still have to build and move with a lot of those things as well.
It also carries, I think, this idea of the replica or the souvenir, and that souvenir is like, I was here. And so there's something definitely about that. Like when people come to America or they come to Canada, particularly, they want Indigenous things to take home. And so, so it becomes this selling of something that is not necessarily the people who are making these objects, right? It's not part of their history. And so as you talk about, it's about consumption, but it's also about appropriation. It's about historical looting. It's about ideas and culture and taking that and then packaging it up for it to go somewhere else. But this idea of I was here, like I keep going back to that because so much of what you do is about land and thinking about place and site. I keep thinking about even these works as being about I was here.
Yeah.
It's a consumerism of the souvenir consumerism.
I mean, there was a time when a ton of books were written about, particularly in Canada, about the souvenir and Indigenous souvenirs. I don't know them and I don't know them well enough to cite them, but I know that there was a lot of literature written about this idea of the souvenir. I want to switch gears. Can I switch gears?
Yeah.
I want to talk about your other things that you do, because you do many things, and you just put out an album, Stand on My Shoulders, correct?
Yep.
Congratulations. And you have people like Portugal the Man, Michelle Undergay-Cello on there, like amazing. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, the music's such a core part of my creative practice in different ways. And I think I really enjoy the collaborative aspect of the music, whether it's performing or working in the studio. Stand on My Shoulders was about 3 years of kind of process and recording to get to this album. When I think about music, there's a lot of freedom in the process, whether it's storytelling, whether it's humanizing relationships, which is something that is not always easily accessible in other creative forms of work and output. There's just a lot of possibilities. And Stand on My Shoulders, the title references kind of our ancestors and elders and those that have come before us and our ability to be where we are because of what they've provided, and whether it's knowledge and care or, all of these things. So the imagery of that's a monoprint on the album, and the monoprint is like an abstract image of my father's regalia, ceremonial regalia, that he walked into the forest 4 years ago or so, and just recognizing that he still exists in love and the family with us in different ways, and that somebody else will fill that regalia. And this is how continuum moves on and forward. So think about that with this record is just kind of acknowledging that in a way. So yeah, time and continuum.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So I also spotted on Instagram that you're collaborating with a choreographer.
I am. Yeah. I love working in a practice or space sometimes where I don't really know what's going to happen. because it requires a lot of openness, a lot of listening, a lot of investigation. And that's what this has been so far. So I'm working with Fist and Heel Performance Group and choreographer Reggie Wilson. I met Reggie at Bellagio Rockefeller Fellowship in Italy years ago, and we kind of started this idea of a collaborative project. A lot of it's been understandings of our different practices. We come from such far creative processes and practice that for me, it's been really rewarding and challenging. I don't know what it'll be fully yet, but we had a week at Jacob's Pillow, and that was kind of the real work started on our project. So we're still building it.
Yeah. Will there be a performance at Jacob's Pillow of the work?
I'm not sure if it'll be at Jacob's Pillow yet. I'd love to debut it there. We would love to if we could, but I don't know where or what. This is all new to me. So yeah.
It's all very exciting. I think it's fabulous to put yourself into a position where you're like open to the unknown.
Yeah, it was amazing so far. Like working with the dancers has been incredible. I feel like stepping into this side of performance, because we know I perform with music and stuff, but like, I don't know, it feels like a real dimensional form of working. It includes sound, it includes song, it includes movement, it includes visual if you want. Yeah.
It's exploring that multidisciplinary. I really want to be mindful of time. Do you have anything else you wanted to add, Emily?
I was just going to ask what you have coming up.
Sure. I mean, I have more biennial projects coming up that I probably can't announce in that time frame yet. Some more shows for music. Always have like.
Are you coming to New York at all?
My next solo exhibition will be at Peter Bloom Gallery in March of 27, around there. Okay. So I'll definitely be out there then. I have to fly to London soon to do some site visits for something in the UK. And I've got to fly to Mexico for site visits for something.
Do you enjoy the travel?
I do. Yeah, it's a lot, but I'm just in it. So it's
great.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for fitting us into your busy schedule, because I know you do have a very busy schedule, and for talking to us today. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. And so if you want to know more about Nicholas Galanin's work, you can visit his artist page at Peter Bloom Gallery.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Your tax-deductible donations make this podcast possible. Please support us at internationalarrivals.org.